with Mr. Spengeman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Goodale, nice to see you. Good to have you and your team back in front of the committee. And I'd like to take you to your last submission and ask you to give us a bit more of a fine-grained view of your vision for the immigration detention facilities and the changes there too. And is this analysis one that's driven by numbers? Is it driven by qualitative differences or challenges that you've alluded to in terms of youth being detained? And how do you see this framework evolve over, let's say, the next 5 years?
Well, there are only 3 federal immigration holding centres in Canada. In Surrey, British Columbia, right at the airport actually, in Richmond in BC, in Laval, Quebec, and in Toronto. Those are the largest intake centres for newcomers arriving in Canada, so logically the federal facilities would be there. They are often overtaxed in terms of volume, and the next resort is to rely upon provincial correctional facilities in the neighbourhood to deal with people where detention is the only alternative. The numbers we feel in these various federal and provincial facilities are simply too high, and we believe that the provincial facilities in particular are problematic because they are correctional facilities, and the people who are being detained for immigration purposes are intermingled. So
there's a stigma issue, if I can address.
Yes, there is, and we want to get rid of that as much as possible. The reason for detention is really only in 3 particular cases where there is a real problem in identifying who the person is, and identification is obviously a critical factor in assessing safety considerations, and often CBSA is not able, with the information available to them, to precisely identify the individual. So if there's an identification issue, if there is a flight risk, or if there is a serious risk to the public, then detention becomes an alternative that CBSA can consider as a last resort. The problem with the circumstances of the past and up to now is that there aren't very many other resorts to consider. So detention too often becomes the default mechanism. So we want to improve these facilities, the 3 facilities, to make sure that they can handle more people in a better way and take the reliance off of the provincial correctional facilities. Secondly, make sure that in those federal holding centres, that the appropriate mental health and physical health services are available, that legal counselling and other counselling is available, that inspections can be done by the Red Cross and by the UN High Commission on Refugees as and when necessary at their discretion. And we also want to make sure that there are other physical alternatives to detention. So we're discussing with a whole variety of immigrant support organizations what those alternatives might be. The Toronto Bail Program, for example, has been used as a good example of what an alternative might look like. There may be electronic means, voice identification, new technology, for example, that could be of assistance. So that CBSA officers will have a broader array of alternatives to look at, to keep the public safe, and to make sure that refugees are treated, the people who are in the circumstances of detention are dealt with in a proper, humane way. And when it comes to children, as much as possible, we want to eliminate that altogether.
Thank you very much for that. Minister, in the transfers under public safety, there's a $41 million transfer from PSEP to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for First Nations community policing. This committee had the correctional investigator, the former correctional investigator, Mr. Howard Sapers, before just recently to comment on the 2016 report. Could you let the committee know your vision of what needs to happen in First Nations policing? The argument we often hear is that our correctional facilities are overcrowded because of the upstream challenges that may exist. If you can just give us an update in the context of this $41 million transfer of what your thoughts are.
Both the Justice Minister and I have mandate instructions from the Prime Minister to work with all dimensions of the criminal justice system to deal with the very negative consequences of that system for a great many Indigenous people. Minister Wilson-Raybould, as you know, has a whole range of laws and procedures under consideration. One of the dimensions of it that relates to my portfolio is the First Nations policing program. That program was established in the early 1990s. The last minister to actually give it a policy facelift was Solicitor General Herb Gray in 1996. It hasn't been improved in terms of policy since that time. Give Mr. Gray a lot of credit for what he did back then, but that's over 20 years ago. It's time to bring the policy up to date. It also has not had a financial increment since 2009. The arrangement is basically a 50-50 arrangement, almost 50-50. It's 52-48 between the federal government and the provinces, where we each contribute an amount to the First Nations policing program, and then try our best to provide, in consultation with First Nations communities, good, solid policing services. But with the amount of money that's available and the policy framework that's available today, we're not nearly meeting the need. Probably not much more than half of the communities that could qualify for this kind of service actually have it. And the objective here is to bring the policy up to date so that Indigenous communities can count upon top-notch policing services that are equal in terms of standard and professionalism to the policing services that every other group of Canadians take for granted. Make sure that the cultural sensitivity is there in the way the service is delivered, and make sure that there is adequate financing on a long-term basis. And many of the First Nations have said to us, you should really think of whether or not a First Nations policing program, which implies that it's temporary, is the right way to go when you're providing a fundamental service like a police service. And maybe there should be a more comprehensive and permanent basis for the way in which all governments come together to ensure safety in First Nations communities.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Clement.